All right. So, as both Kevin and Peter, you have introduced yourself, so maybe Gail, you could give introduction.
Hi, this is Gail Mosey. I work with the National Renewable Energy Lab. We're located in Golden, Colorado, which is just west of Denver, Colorado. I've worked there for 13 years, and for the past several years, I've worked on siting considerations for renewable energy on disturbed lands.
Right, and maybe now that you're on, maybe you could talk a little bit about what is the potential in this? What is the possibilities?
Right. So I think as Pete mentioned earlier, we've talked a lot about the last day and a half, a lot about using renewable energy to power mining operations, but my interest lies more in repurposing mine lands with renewable energy. And we have a lot of potential aside from mine lands in the States for this type of opportunity, not only with solar, but also with wind. And potentially some biomass operations. But there's an array of different types of mine lands that are available in the States that could conceivably be repurposed with renewable energy.
Right. Then, Kevin, to the question, what is the benefits for the mines to include renewables in their rehabilitation plans? Maybe you could put some extra comments to that.
Well, and I think Pete mentioned this in his presentation as well, but we as wind developers, and it's the same thing on solar, we actually pay rent and royalty payments to landowners that allow us to host energy projects on their lands. So, and that varies based on location or type of application that you're putting on there. But in the case of wind power, it's not uncommon for, payments per turbine to be about $20,000 or $25,000 US per turbine per year. And oftentimes, again, this is land that, depending on the state, they'll have to do some amount of reclamation to, but it isn't land that they're going to develop a housing project on, generally speaking. It isn't land that is going to be a golf course or something like that. So for them that are holding the land, it's a nice way to continue to gain revenue from it beyond the life of the mine.
Yeah. And Peter, what's your comments to this?
Well,
if you have further comments, yeah.
Yeah, I would say many of the same things. And as I mentioned in the talk, both of the mining projects we have done have been on former mines, essentially, on the grid. And the economic interests of the mining folks were all just landlords. They did not want to get involved in all of what goes into developing solar. So there are the economic benefits without which we don't think we go forward at all. On top of that, many mines have exhibited a desire to maximize the social license aspect of being part of a host community. And so obviously, whether it's wind or solar or another renewable option, the low carbon future, the inability or I guess the avoidance of using carbon-based fuels is very important to some of the people in the mix. And also, as Kevin mentioned, it tends to be the case, and it was certainly the case on our landfill projects in Massachusetts, that the host community benefits handsomely from very rich lease payments, and we also hire plenty of folks for the construction. There aren't that many permanent employees for the ongoing operations, but they exist. Those jobs exist. So that's a benefit as well.
So at this moment, do you have mines that comes and say we need to look at our rehabilitation plan and then include yourself in discussing what could be done?
Well, it depends on the mineral. Obviously, the mining community, to generalize, is having a challenging time. We're certainly in conversations nationwide, and as Kevin mentioned very eloquently as to Pennsylvania, a lot of where we're active has to do with state incentives for solar energy. So we're having conversations with coal miners in particular all across the United States, and we're trying to reduce those conversations to the states where it would make sense, where we could do a project that pencils out for the financial community as well as works for those folks who are looking ahead to some alternative to using their lands as coal mines.
And Gail, can you comment on this as well?
Made me think of the conversation we had earlier about all the states are a little bit different in terms of the incentives that they offer, and also we're regional in terms of electricity pricing. So while one project technically might pencil out anywhere, it doesn't necessarily pencil out economically. So it's definitely something that we need to keep in mind as we're evaluating these projects in the United States.
Kevin, in respect of developing these projects, how does that differ from developing other types of projects?
Well, it can make it easier in some respects for us. Wind development isn't always popular amongst everyone in each of these communities. But when you have a piece of land that is an abandoned mine, generally speaking, people don't live as close to those as a wooded hill, things like that. And, a lot of people in the community are actually happy to see someone coming in and using that land for development. So I think that the communities in which we've developed have certainly gotten behind it a little bit more than they would have maybe a normal wind project because some of this land is just blighted and truly just abandoned, ugly land. I think that Pennsylvania, as well as other states, have done a better job in the past several years of making reclamation a bigger priority. But back in the day, it wasn't the case. And so I think it's an opportunity for the community to get behind a project and, like I said, perhaps make it a little easier to develop.
Right. And Peter, what do you think?
Well, I have many of the same themes that Kevin articulated, but in addition, I would say that it's a little bit of a mixed bag to develop on these sites, in that in many ways we get great enthusiasm because there's not a lot of ready alternative uses for the sites. At the same time, and I'm thinking particularly of when we have to interact with the financial community to actually fund a project, a lot of these types of projects have never been done before. So to Gail's point, no two of them are identical, and so when people say, what's the pattern? You say, there's really no precedent for this. And so on the one hand, there tends to be a lot of community support and general enthusiasm, in our case, both from the regulatory community as well as the host community. On the other hand, we have undue amount of missionary work that we need to do with the financial community almost every time as a result of being the first of something.
Due to this is rehabilitation sites, is it more difficult to find financing for these, you think?
I do. And as is evidence of many of the things we talked about, there's no one size that fits all. So we can always find, I'll call it adventurous private equity money, which is relatively expensive. Those folks are looking for a big return on their investment. The other end of the spectrum, of course, is conventional bank financing. Those folks tend to be extremely cautious, understandably, and they're lending out their money at much lower rates. So from our perspective, obviously, projects tend to pencil with some middle ground. And so you go from banks at the one end of the spectrum to private equity firms on the other hand. In between are kind of the strategics, the late great Sun Edison, the Solar Cities, and some of the folks who've maintained an integrated equipment production, perhaps, function along with a development function. They have succeeded in raising a bunch of money, which they'll deploy to these projects. So it's still Wild West out there, honestly. We can typically find the money, but the cost of it might be prohibitive.
Just continuing a little bit, what are the typical concerns for those who wish to finance such projects? Well,
we go back long enough that I remember when almost everybody but private equity money was frightened about closed municipal landfills. Yeah. And so there was a cottage industry, as I mentioned, of redeveloping closed municipal landfills in Massachusetts. On day one, which wasn't so long ago, this is probably 2011, it was the rare financier who would venture onto a landfill. Right. Nowadays, They forgot all about that, and they develop without asking a question, which I think is a little bit overdoing it. The ongoing angst on the financial community has to do, in our case, in our experience, with Superfund sites. So, for example, the mine that we did in Vermont is a Superfund site today. And so we had to look very hard to find a financial partner for that.
Okay, thanks. Gail, and how do you see these sites being different to greenfield sites?
So one point I wanted to make is that we have so far been talking about contaminated sites in the U.S., at which there are a number of them, and some of the conversation has focused around repurposing those sites. But there's also the aspect that we don't want to lose sight of mines planning into their closure plans even some renewable energy mitigation or repurposing. So don't necessarily want to lose sight of that. We do have a situation where we do have a lot of these lands, and so in terms of developing these sites over greenfields, for instance, in some cases, we've got considerations where land is at a premium. And it makes more sense to develop these sites than it does a greenfield, because the greenfield could certainly be put to other use where, in many cases, these lands cannot. So that's, in my perspective, and I've been working on this since 2008, I'd like to think that some of the effort, I worked a lot with the Environmental Protection Agency on the Repowering America's Lands initiative, and one of their pushes really early on was solar on landfills. So I'd like to think that might have played the role in making that, just bringing that to market and making it more accessible. But in my mind, the big thing about all of this, and the driving force for me, is that it just makes a lot more sense to develop these lands than it does a green space.
If there still is a power consumption, I guess.
What's that?
I guess sometimes when you close a mine, there is no further consumption at this such area.
Right. So I'm thinking in terms of grid connecting.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, Kevin, maybe you could repeat again what are the potential risks and liabilities in respect of these projects. And of course, I find it interesting when you wish to place turbines and foundations on such piles of material that has been put up.
Yeah, it was certainly getting the every project goes through a period of due diligence with the lending partners that you work with, and a large part of that is an independent engineer. Generally speaking, they look at the type of turbine and your wind data, and they say, okay, this is, we believe that this will produce this amount of energy. They don't spend a great deal of time on foundations, or hadn't, but in this case of this project, there was a great deal more scrutiny put on it, just to make sure that the project wouldn't fail and we wouldn't have any issues with it, which did add some expense, but it was nothing that the project couldn't handle, thankfully. I do think, and I don't want to overstate the fact that solar could fit easier into some of these spots, because I do think that there's still some engineering concerns there as well. But I do think that, as Gail mentioned, these are lands that have already had kind of the development done to them, and it makes a natural progression going forward. Grid connectivity is sometimes difficult, but I do believe that if it's a good enough project site, you can make the transmission work, and you can make it get grid connected. Solar has an opportunity because you can generally connect into lower voltage lines, so you don't need the large power lines that you sometimes do with a big wind farm, which increases its accessibility to having development on that land. So.
There's just, in addition, one more. If you at a particular mine site have built up a very large pile of material, so a sort of a small mountain, would you be able to assess that sufficiently to put, for example, wind turbines up top of such a pile of material, or would you put it next to, or what's your view on these things?
Yeah, we stayed away from any areas that hadn't already been reclaimed and hadn't already settled us to a certain extent over the years. We didn't. We are, however, looking at a location in more in central Pennsylvania currently that it will be that type of a site. So we haven't done all the engineering that we need to do. I think it'll be achievable with. Again, the foundation, we may need to use piling or something, like that to make it work. But, there's a lot of smart engineers out there, and there's a lot of good construction companies, and a lot smarter than I am, and can make these things work. So.
What if a turbine starts to tip due to what do you do then? Can you fix that? Or?
Well, we do. We actually do monitor our turbines for a variety of things, and we are even able to see if it's ever out of balance. It's very sensitive to any type of out of balance situation, and we've not seen that, knock on wood, at either of our facilities built on reclaimed mines. So. We're in, and those have been operating for, the oldest one was 2009, so it's been around for a while. You would think that you would get some settling, and we haven't had any problems. So.
And you can have sufficient documentation so you can get proper insurance, or
We didn't have any problems really. Once the independent engineers got comfortable with our method and the of soil compaction as well as the foundation design, we really didn't have an issue. I mean, we carry insurance, and it was no more expensive. It was no higher than it would have been on a traditional greenfield development, which also can have, their issues in terms of soil stabilization and what types of materials are below the ground. So,
yeah. Peter, could you elaborate a little bit on that, on risk and liabilities in such projects here?
Gladly. Well, we encounter a lot of the same dynamics. I think in this case, what we are always looking at are the local conditions, and I think as Gail mentioned, no two of these are identical. So, and without evading your question, but we look at situations in the Northeast where land is very scarce and precious, and insulation isn't very good. And the project that I described in some detail, land is not at a premium in the Southwest, generally speaking, and the insulation is fabulous by our standards. So at the end of the day, we have to consider those factors as well as local utility costs and balance where we can make a project that works. In our case, we're fairly experienced and fairly comfortable with a range of contamination issues. So we have our parameters, like Kevin does, as to how there is no such thing as too contaminated. We haven't done a nuclear site, but we've even looked at those, so that's not an issue. But geotechnically, how long has a capped area been capped? How topographically variable is it? There are limitations. We've done projects, for example, that are both ballasted, mounted racking systems like I had in the cartoon I put up there, as well as clean areas where we put pole-driven assets in the same site. So there is no one-size-fits-all, but the contamination never daunts us. The local situation can be all over the map as to what we encounter.
Right, okay. Gail, will carbon incentive and carbon tax, will that increase or help these sites?
When I was reviewing that question, I was trying to formulate my answer. I think the obvious answer would be yes. I don't see why not. But I guess a lot of it depends on who ultimately is the owner of the of the property and who would benefit from it. We're talking mostly about mining companies, but in many cases, these sites aren't even necessarily owned by the mining company anymore. So I think it just depends on a lot on ownership. You guys probably have a little bit more to say about that.
Yeah, Kevin.
What I was going to say, it's actually a great point, is some of the land around our site in Pennsylvania is actually now owned by the state of Pennsylvania. And that was done, again, back in the day when the mining industry had a very powerful lobby in Pennsylvania. They used to abandon a site and then sell it to the state for $1, and then the state would own it. The state put that land into, some of that land into forestry, only as a management technique, as a management tool. So it's very difficult to see some of this land being used in a different scheme, I guess you would say, a different financing scheme or in carbon tech, because they're just a manager of the data or of the land. But I think depending on ownership, yeah, you could have a situation where a carbon tax could be used and some sort of trading to be done between the entities once that land is developed. So.
Yeah. Now, have you seen obstacles or when you were working on your project? Did you find obstacles in financing it, or how was that? Maybe you could comment on that.
You know, wind projects, generally speaking, if you have a good windy site, the financing will come. It is, you know, as long as it ticks a certain number of the boxes and it has certain parameters. We've not really found the financing to be difficult. One of the areas in the U.S. that can be a little bit more difficult is tax equity financing based around the production tax credit. That's getting a little bit into the weeds. But I think if you have a good project, whether it's solar or whether it's wind, you're going to find somebody that'll make it work from a financing point of view. As Pete mentioned, some may take a little bit more slice of the pie than you want to, but I think you're going to get your project built. So.
Peter, your views on does CO2 carbon tax, does that assist these projects?
Well, I would echo Gail's statements and say, in general, I would say yes, but these projects, on the other hand, face so many headwinds that carbon tax is just one of them, and frankly, carbon tax will be knowable when and if it gets implemented. And I say that because when someone's doing a project pro forma, considering a carbon tax, at least it will be a real live number that you can evaluate. So I would suspect that it will not assist the development of these projects. I don't think it's going to be as material as a lot of other challenges to these projects, frankly.
Okay. Gail, in respect of what funds are available for these projects?
Right. So let's see. So I work for NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, and our prime funder is the Department of Energy. And Department of Energy regularly issues funding announcements for pilot projects or test projects or funding such as that would move a project along. The Environmental Protection Agency does the same thing. There has to be a degree of contamination on sites that would fall under EPA's purview, and that's not necessarily the case for Department of Energy. So there's options there. There's the ability for people to get onto funding announcement lists. If anybody's interested, feel free to let me know. I know that NREL also offers technical assistance. So a state agency can apply for technical assistance to evaluate a site, and it at least gets you a little further down the road in determining whether or not a renewable energy is viable on the site.
So that's in respect of reviewing the site, but what for the actual project?
So the technical assistance would be for reviewing the site, but the prior funding that I mentioned is for actual construction on the site.
And what is the nature of it? Is it grants? Is it interest-free loans, or what is it?
It would grants, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and it depends. In some cases, they're looking for pilot. They're looking for innovative solutions. All the announcements are a little bit different in terms of what they're looking for.
What's the level of grant, for example? Maybe you could
Well,
elaborate
for
a little
instance,
bit.
the DOE just issued a $30 million grant. I don't know how they'll parse it out per project. That's a good question. I was looking for that answer before because I just got the email and I was looking for that answer, but I didn't see it before I came up here. So 30 million spread across X number of projects.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right. Kevin, maybe you know more about the nature of these funds.
We actually haven't availed ourselves to any of those types of funds specifically for reclamation projects. We did, Pennsylvania has some energy grants just for energy projects in general, not necessarily for those. So I'm not as familiar with anything. Maybe Pete has used those.
We have neither used those. On the other hand, there is the standing federal investment tax credit, which is a form of public incentive. Exactly where that's going to go in the wake of the elections 2 weeks ago is an imponderable right now. That's one. And then we've been most active on mining properties and otherwise in states where there are also state level of incentives built in. So they're not necessarily grant funding that Gail was talking about, or the kind of incentives that you might think directly go to this sort of project, but they are generic to everything that we would do as solar developers. The other thing I would mention, which actually is very valuable, but it's not, it's impossible to quantify, is just simply the goodwill one gets from doing one of these projects, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. So we did a project, for example, and I can talk about this to some extent because the EPA sure does. We did a project in the Midwest where we redeveloped a site to make it suitable for solar, and the site was a capped area where it was disposed decades ago mining residue. So it was literally bauxite mining waste that they dumped into some gypsum bathtubs. And because of the goodwill of the EPA had wanted to do a cleanup fix that was going to be about $80 or $90 million. And then to Gail's point on the Repower America project, we said, geez, I think we can do solar here. And that cleanup for the solar application turned out to be about $25 million. So that's not a grant, that's not a clear incentive, but the goodwill can really be worth a lot depending on the circumstances.
Right. Gail, is an element of this funding, I'm just coming back to this, but it's an element where if you experiment more, demonstrate more, you know, various types of renewables, does grant then grow in size, or is there any incentive in that sense?
So I think as far as experimenting or looking at different types, I do think in terms of what they're looking for are kind of innovative solutions. And so that may have an impact on the size of the grant. Probably also directly impacting the size of the grant is frankly the size of the project, and how much you think the project might cost. So that's probably one of your bigger factors. A lot of what they look at is, can you justify the level of the grant that you're requesting? And there's just a process that they go through in terms of determining whether or not the amount that you're requesting makes sense with what you actually want to do at the site.
So you see is it quite a conservative project, so wind or solar projects that you expect will come, or will you see this as an opportunity where more experiments will come?
I think there's probably a combination of both. I think that in terms of innovative, you know, we're talking not only about the type of renewable energy technology, but maybe about how a deal is structured, you know, how you're able to work with the utility, kind of creative, outside the box thinking in terms of how you structure things, and maybe the approach that you use for the EPA on contaminated lands, maybe how you're going to deal with the level of contamination, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Peter, what role will local government have to support these, have in supporting these projects?
The host municipality tends to be more of a cheerleader. What they're interested in, as Kevin was mentioning, are tax revenues, and they can benefit handsomely from those, and also job creation. So if we as a developer are able to offer both tax revenues and job creation from a project, they'd be very enthusiastic. Again, in the lower 48 state system, most of the action is in the states where there are strong incentives at the state level, as well as federal incentives on top of that. So there's generally receptivity and enthusiasm for solar projects, and solar projects on mine is an example. In terms of hard and fast dollars and cents, we haven't seen much of that. We have not relied upon it. But it's generally considered good news if you're taking a dormant property and doing something with it that's productive and forward-looking.
Such projects, do they have to come in tender, or how is they exactly identified and developed?
It depends. So if they're publicly owned, for example, I was mentioning the Massachusetts town-owned landfills. Those are procured through a standard RFP, public sector procurement process. So they'll float an RFP, we will submit proposals, and there's a competition to see how we win them. If they're privately controlled, there really aren't that many rules. There may be private tender, or there may just be relationship-driven redevelopment efforts where people know us and trust us from past lives, and we go forward on that basis. But the rules are much less strict in the private sector.
In the private sector, who takes the initiative generally at this moment for these projects?
Well, it's changing, of course. As I said, everything is changing. Historically, folks tended to sit on properties that were not productive, that were often contaminated. I'm sure you've seen that dynamic because big organizations who are our typical counterparty are not anxious to publicize the fact that there's a dormant contaminated property. So if they're not having their hand forced to do something, they tend not to do stuff. On the other hand, with the recognition, both for sort of the social license reasons as well as for practical reasons, if a private enterprise realizes it may have an asset that it used to consider a liability, they may well take the initiative and reach out. We're part of one right now, actually, not too far away in Buffalo, where there was a large privately owned company that said, but public in our securities law reasons, but private sector company that reached out and did a private tender offer. It's got a redevelopment feature. It's also got a solar feature.
And Kevin, what do you think the role of local government is in this?
Well, I think that for solar projects and wind projects, there needs to be some involvement, as Peter mentioned, in terms of the cheerleading aspect. But there can be tax incentives. Generally speaking, wind projects do not pay. They aren't taxed like a house would be. There's a payment in lieu of taxes or some type of mechanism set up, which benefits both the host community as well as the developer. And that's a common economic development tool used for building factories and all sorts of different things. So I think that the role of the local government is one of could be one of permitting and support in that respect. The projects that we build require large equipment to be carried through. So you really do need to have the buy-in of the communities when you're hauling several ton turbine parts through a community. A cheerleader, I think, is a great way to describe it. I think if a community gets on board, it makes it a lot easier. So it could be both financial, as I mentioned, or it could be in permitting. It could be in other types of support functions, just, like I said, getting logistics and helping with logistics, transportation, once the project's up and operating. The wind project that I did in my case study, we hired about 120 people over the life of the construction cycle. There are 8 full-time people working there now in this community. Those jobs are all of the jobs that I mentioned, the 8 full-time jobs pay over the median income. So they're happy to have those jobs and that there. So it's easy for the local communities to give some other benefits in the form of perhaps a tax break, in the form of payment in lieu of taxes, something like that, because the other benefits are there.
But just continuing, did you see in your project that the approval process were faster or
It did go faster. It was something that the community welcomed. It was something that they thought was a great reuse of the project, and it was a source of revenue that they didn't have. It was a source of tax revenue that we were creating. We also try to help with the local community. We did some sponsorships of local recreation, and there's a part of us being a good neighbor as well. We purchase the goods, as much goods and services as we can locally. But even things, that part of Pennsylvania gets a lot of snow. We give out a contract that I think one of the years in recent past was worth $200,000 a year to clear snow from the roads that we use. So, there's a lot of money that we spend in the communities, and so they're happy to help that along. I don't think they, just welcomed us and said, do whatever you want. There was a permitting process, and they made sure that certain criteria were met. But once we met all those criteria, I think they were very welcoming.
Gail, could you comment on this, but also if you had further ideas how how local government could motivate more of these projects?
Right, so I think that you guys are absolutely right in terms of a cheerleader. We call it a champion in the community. If there's somebody who is really driven behind having these sites redeveloped, it's a huge help, whether it's a member of the community, a member of the local government, even if it's a developer who, for whatever reason, wants to see something happen at this site. If we have that single driving force, that makes a big difference. So that really helps. I mean, there's always the permitting process that you have to go through, and that can only be speeded up so much. But it does help if someone's on top of it and keeps the process moving along. As far as the government being engaged, Pete, I think you mentioned how sometimes people don't necessarily, they've got a site in their area, but they don't necessarily want to raise it up the flagpole that the site is in the area. They're happy with it just kind of laying dormant and maybe people not even completely realizing that it's there. But I do think that there's information out there in terms of identifying these sites. There is a Google Earth mapping tool that shows all of the different contaminated lands across the United States. And then you can also access some databases from Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and USGS on identifying these sites. So the interesting thing about mine lands, I will say, is that they don't necessarily fall under the jurisdiction always of the Environmental Protection Agency. They're kind of their own type of land. And so in many cases, they do fall under the data and the information that EPA can provide. But in other cases, you do have to do a little bit of digging. And Pete and I were talking last night at dinner about, how do you find the sites? And you said that the sites so far have come to you. And that may be, right now how it needs to happen. But there are ways to find these sites. If anybody's interested, feel free to ask me later. I can give you links and information.
What other ideas could be there for local government could do to make these happen? Just some, what could be smart, do you think?
Yeah, I think that just really raising awareness. I know that when and a mine site is not a landfill, but it's a good example where landfills are everywhere. I'll be driving with my kids on vacation, and I'll say, there's a landfill, there's a landfill, there's a landfill, and they're like, Mom, and I'm sorry, we need to be aware. We need to be aware of the degree of contaminated sites around the U.S., and some of those, unfortunately, happen to be mine sites, which, just by the practices in the early years, that's the nature of the site. But there's definitely rehabilitation and repurposing opportunities for these sites, and using them over green space is paramount.
Yeah. Okay. The last question here, Peter. How should developers approach this? What to do?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity, and we heard a lot of statistics over the last day and a half as to how compelling it really is. For developers, I think that what we have to provide more than anything else is, again, cost effectiveness and reliability. Because so many of these component parts of a successful project development are in motion, we have to be prepared as developers to be flexible both as to business structures and as to technical responses to these challenges. But if we're willing to do that, I think there's all kinds of upside here. I think the introduction of battery storage assets is only going to enhance the reliability and productivity of these projects, and we as developers have to be on top of that technically as well so that we can offer that to folks who really are here to mine minerals, not to generate renewable energy.
The developers, should they have knowledge about contaminated land? Do you need special knowledge, or how is that?
Well, I would say yes, of course, but no, I don't think so. I mean, I think that's where we dwell. For mining properties, the waste rock pile we're working on in Arizona doesn't happen to be contaminated. That could be done by a lot of people. The Superfund site we're doing in Vermont is contaminated. There's heavy analysis, particularly by the financial community, of the interaction of federal and state laws there. That's for a specialist. That's for folks like us. I wouldn't add to the kit of skills of your average developer contaminated land. that can be found. You know, we're specialists, but I wouldn't say that's a must-do for people who want to develop solar on mines.
Okay. Kevin, your view on this?
Well, I think that when we go into a community, we always view it as a partnership with the community, a partnership with the landowners. We have mom and pop landowners. We have farmers that are landowners. We have people that use their land for recreation in terms of hunting. We have people who are corporate owners. We have had timber investment companies. And I think for a developer, this represents another partnership opportunity. And all of those partnerships are different in some ways. Some of them want to make an investment. Some of them, as Pete mentioned, just want to go ahead and lease the land. But I think moving forward, especially as certain parts of mines become less active, I do believe there's a development opportunity, and I think that it's, you talk about an opportunity for developers. I think it's an opportunity for the landowners as well to look at what else can be done, another source of revenue, moving forward when the mine is no longer active. So.
Do in private sector, do the owners, do they want to be part of these projects? What's your experience?
I think it depends. I think that in the beginning, I think a lot of people were just happy to go ahead and lease their land. But I could certainly see, for example, we have a timber company that we've worked with. The first project we worked with them, they just wanted to lease the land. By the time we started looking at some of their other holdings, they were interested in an investment. Because anywhere where you have a bank of land, and in the case of timber companies, they're looking at a long-term holding of the project, of the lands, and so for them to be able to use a compatible use and get extra revenue from it, either in the form of lease payments or as part of the development fee at the end of the project being built, I think that they are very savvy to look at, the land as an asset and how can we get more money from the asset.
But do you see them investing into these projects?
I think that'll come. I do think that'll come. One area that could be interesting, in the United States, there's a big commercial and industrial push right now to buy power from wind farms. I think a next logical approach would be more companies getting involved in the tax equity financing of it. So if they do have a tax burden, that could become more of an investment vehicle. So companies have invested in renewables. Companies will continue to invest in renewables in some shape or form, whether it's outright ownership or some sort of financing, or even, like I said, placing tax equity. So.
And Gail, the last input here, what should developers do to access this market? What's your input?
So as far as developers accessing the market, I think that I've talked a little bit about this in terms of the information that's available, kind of accessing where the high potential sites are. You can look on EPA's Repowering America's Lands website, and they've got the Google Earth tool that allows you to screen for the different sites for solar and wind, so that you can narrow down some of your high potential sites. And there's the aspect too of, it's kind of a lot of things have to come together for these sites to work. Some of the most important things are to have an off-taker. You have to have your technical resource. Hopefully be in a state that has good incentives. Be in a state that has high electricity prices. That a lot of things that can kind of come together. That if you can work on screening those items while you're looking at a site, it'll save you a lot of time in terms of just drilling down into some high potential sites.
Okay, thank you. Is there time for questions? Or? Right.
Okay. Thank you very much, Thomas, Gail, Kevin, and Pete. That was great. Thank you.